Hey everyone, welcome back to What Can Brown Jazz Vinyl. The topic for today is Kenny Burrell's 1543, or his self-titled album for Blue Note. The reason why I wanted to cover this today is because Blue Note just put out a reissue of this title in their Tone Poet series. So this is one of those things that was a Joe Harley, Kevin Gray, RTI, other things kind of reissue. A lot of energy around this series. There's a lot of folks who collect every single title. I'm not one of those folks who collects every single title. For the most part, the only ones that I've purchased are ones that didn't come out in sort of sequential order, right? Not sequential, but like, you know, it didn't come out at the time period that it was actually recorded. So the first record where I didn't follow that logic was Blue Train, which I covered in a previous video. And the second one is right here, Kenny Burrell's 1543. And so I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, why I felt compelled to purchase it, but then also do a little bit of a shootout between the original that I have here and the Tone Poet. So let's kind of dive right in. So first of all, a couple of things. I mentioned 1956 that this was recorded. This album is a little strange in terms of Blue Note's sort of catalog overall, and that it's a little bit of a mishmash of a number of different sessions at a number of different studios. Now, they were all recorded in 1956, but there's actually 3 locations involved in these tracks that are included here. One is called Audio Video Studios, apparently in New York. I don't even know what that is. The other is Van Gelder Studios, which would have been Hackensack if it's 1956. And then the third is actually recorded at the Cafe Bohemia. So that's kind of interesting because that particular track happens to have Kenny Dorham and J.R. Monrose on it. And in fact, that track, there's only one track actually that was recorded at the Cafe Bohemia that has those two horns on it. Bobby Timmons is on piano on that track as well. Great track. But that one was actually recorded at the very same session as the Kenny Dorham at the Cafe Bohemia Blue Note album. So what they did was they left off that track off of that particular title, and they ended up putting it on this album, which, as I said, is already kind of a mishmash of different formats and different settings. In terms of the formats, there's actually 12 musicians that are featured on this album. However, no more than 5 at a time. So how that manifests itself is just a variety of different formats. You even have a track with Kenny Burrell actually solo. I think it's track 2, maybe even one of the highlights of the entire album. But it's kind of interesting. It doesn't necessarily have continuity, neither in terms of sound nor in terms of style, and certainly not in terms of the musicians that are in these tracks. But you know, all that being said, it's not like Tone Poet was doing this for the first time. This was the album that was originally put out. It's how it was intended. In any event. The reason why I wanted to not only cover this in a shootout, but also specifically pick up this album was a couple of things. One is that Tone Poet hasn't done mono much. I believe that, well, so of course Blue Train, right? Everybody knows that that release from a few weeks ago was put out in mono. I want to say Chet Baker Sings might have been mono, but like it's weird because even the titles that you'd think would be mono, like Lee Morgan's The Cooker, they put out in stereo. So it's kind of interesting to see which titles they decide to do in mono versus the ones they don't. Now, I acknowledge that this was early enough that there probably isn't a stereo version available. And that's probably the primary reason why they didn't put it out in stereo. But I'm still kind of curious, right? Because there are stereo and mono editions of a number of these albums, including The Cooker. In fact, The Cooker wouldn't have been put out in stereo until probably a few years after. I'm trying to think about the chronology. I can't imagine that record being put out in stereo until, like, you know, 1959, 1960. So anyway, it's interesting to me when they choose to put out a record in mono, and of a album like this that is sort of, I'll say particularly in the period of 1956 in terms of how it sounds. And you know, some people associate that time period sound as sort of quintessentially hard bop, or, you know, being aggressive, or being sort of what they want to hear. And Tone Poet, you know, to be fair, has a little bit of a reputation for, you know, taking taking liberties, right, with the sound, with the production, making changes. And so I wanted to hear exactly what they would do with this particular album. And that's why I picked it up. Now, the other reason why I picked it up is because my copy, this original right here, is not in great shape. It's not trashed or anything, but it's like VG minus, right? I probably should have covered this in my Blue Note Records in Bad Condition video that I did somewhat recently. If you haven't checked it out, you should. So yeah, I wanted to hear what a good sounding copy sounded like, and this is a record that you can't really find audiophile quality versions of, at least up until now. As far as I know, Analog Productions has never touched this title. Music Matters has never touched this title. It hasn't been in BN 75, BN 80. I don't know. I mean, so many of the reissues that I see are these like United Artists kind of era ones, right? That maybe have that rechanneled stereo, or like, just sort of, or they're just they're versions that I just can't vouch for. And so, I was excited that they decided to tackle this title. It hasn't been given a proper audiophile treatment, and I think it's deserving of it. So. All that being said, all that justification, that's why I decided to pick up this record, this Tone Poet edition. And now I would like to kind of dive in and talk a little bit more about the original and about the reissue and a couple of differences, and I'll kind of get at a recommendation, at least as far as I can tell, of which sounds better and why. All right, so let's talk about the original pressing. So here's my copy. First of all, you're going to see some yellowing around the edges and some tape, and it's worse in the back. Whatever, it's an original, and I've been happy with it up until this point, right? Because I haven't had a decent opportunity at getting any type of upgrade copy that's going to sound better. So what I want to say about this particular record is a couple of things. First of all, this is one of those albums that sort of has that quintessential Blue Note sound. And it's good and bad, right? So I mentioned earlier that with this era of music, 1956, a lot of people want jazz to sound a certain way, especially hard bop. They want it to be a little bit raw, a little bit aggressive. I mean, those are attributes that are just, so tightly intertwined with what hard bop is anyway. Sort of virtuosic soloists and, a looseness, but still swinging, and, minimal melody and before they launch into solos. I mean, all of these types of things, right? And you'll find that here. And certainly Kenny Burrell sounds great on this, and as a featured soloist on every single song, he just sounds phenomenal. I mean, this is perhaps some of his best work, at least that I've heard on Blue Note. So I can't really say anything bad about the playing on this record. In fact, I definitely can't. I mean, the playing is just outstanding on all parts. I mean, whether it's Kenny Burrell in the format with the opening track has Candido on it, who's playing bongos, super dynamic song, like perfect one to open up the record. And I actually think that that's the one that was recorded at Audio Video Studios. But really dynamic. Burrell sounds great. Candido is like super hot in the mix, right? Like you can hear his like bongos. I mean, they're just like almost echoing in the room. I mean, it's really, really dynamic and a great track. The second track features Burrell's solo, and the name of that is "But Not For Me." And it's just this kind of extended guitar solo, and it's just him, and it's gorgeous. And even on this original pressing, it sounds great. It sounds dynamic. I mentioned earlier the third track is the one that's at Cafe Bohemia. This is where it's a live format, right? So you kind of have to excuse, I suppose, some of the I don't know, lackluster sound, I guess, of the track. But it sounds very much in the period as well, in that they prioritize the soloists more so than anybody else. Now, that statement that I just said is true across the board for the second side of this album. And I actually think that there's a big difference between the first side and the second side of this album in terms of how it sounds, especially on the original. So as much as I said there's different formats and there's different locations that these tracks were actually recorded at, it's very apparent. Like you can tell based on how each of these tracks sound, which one it is and how it was recorded, and which were recorded at Van Gelder's studio for Blue Note, and that is the second side. So on that second side, you know, the soloists are the priority. As I've said on Blue Train, as I've said on some of these other shootouts, the soloists are the priority and everybody else is pushed to the back. That's just how this stuff was recorded. So Burrell sounds great. There's a few tracks that Frank Foster comes in on. So it's all at Van Gelder's studio and it's all the same group. Some of them don't have Frank Foster, some of them do. Whether or not he's involved or whether it's just Burrell as sort of the, you know, the main, you know, horn or the main soloist, it doesn't matter. They all prioritize the soloists, and the rhythm section is pushed very much to the back. And this even gets to the point where Burrell's guitar has this almost like boomy sort of quality. It's kind of hard to describe. It makes perfect sense in my head because I've heard it on so many other recordings of this era, of this kind of 1956, 1955 even era, where like the soloist, it's just like, it's really boomy and it's like right in your face. And then you kind of have to like strain your ear to hear like, oh, is that the piano? Is there bass playing back there? Is that just Burrell, you know, doing some bass notes on his guitar? And it's a little unfortunate. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great sounding album, but those are some of the, I don't know, complications or, you know, of listening to music of this era, especially in mono, where, you know, they didn't have the ability, I suppose, or maybe interest in upping the level of everything and balancing it perfectly. I mean, you know, these albums were made to highlight the leader, and this one does. You know, Kenny Burrell is the leader on this album, and he sounds fantastic. It's just that, you know, it's a little bit unfortunate that some of the other musicians, it's either hard to hear or you can't hear them at all, and they don't sound as fantastic. So, you know, overall, this record is one of those that, and this kind of feeds into why I wanted to hear what Tone Poet would do with it. It's just the original is not what it feels like it could be. It feels like it could be more dynamic. It certainly feels like it could be more detailed. But again, it's an old pressing, or excuse me, an old recording. And so how much can they do with it? Well, that actually is the perfect segue into the Tone Poet. All right, so this is what the Tone Poet looks like. I'm actually going to take this at kind of the same pace as what I did with the original in terms of like kind of walking through the album and telling you some of the differences. So personally, for me, the opening track of the record on this Tone Poet pressing is probably the one where the Tone Poet doesn't have as much of an improvement. That kind of rawness that you want in hard bop, I feel like, I don't know whether it's just how it was recorded. I mean, there was only one track on this album with this particular lineup. So this is one that was Kenny Burrell, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, Kenny Clark, and then Candido on conga drums. And that rawness is really well preserved in the original, and it manifests itself in the Tone Poet as being a little bit smoother. Now, don't get me wrong, Candido, who I said was really one of the highlights of this track, is still a highlight of the track. He's still like, you know, I mean, it's even louder probably on the Tone Poet, his drums. But in some ways, it feels like the track was sort of smoothed from, you know, from a sonic perspective. It's not quite as dynamic. You know, don't get me wrong, it sounds better. I mean, my you know, my album or my record is, like I said, VG minus. So I'm going to have some pops and crackle and things like that that are going to disrupt the audio. However, I can tell that if I had a, you know, really, really nice original pressing, then I might actually prefer that original version compared to the Tone Poet, just because the Tone Poet feels like it's maybe a little bit too, I don't know, for lack of a better term, produced. Moving on to the second track, which is that Kenny Burrell solo, and it's titled But Not For Me. This one, I feel like the two are almost equal. You know, there's not so much, I feel like, that you can do. You have the original recording that's through a single microphone. I mean, what is Tone Poet going to do? They're not going to, like, you know, what, like, up the, I don't know. I mean, you know, they can still mess with the levels, I suppose, but, like, it doesn't feel, I just feel like it's a wash. Like, there's not really that much of a discernible difference. Track 3 is where things start to, I think, improve for Tone Poet. So that is the live track. It is pretty raw in its original, in the original pressing format, and it kind of just sounds like it's a live recording, for better or for worse. And on the Tone Poet version, I don't know if they reduce the audience noise or if there's just a lower noise floor. Well, that's certainly the case. There's definitely a lower noise floor, but it sounds cleaner. It sounds more dynamic. You can hear the musicians better. You know, Kenny Dorham has a little bit of a reputation for kind of a nasally tone, which is just how he played, especially at certain time periods and on certain recordings. And I just didn't feel, I didn't catch that as much on the Tone Poet. It just felt smoother. It felt like it was like a better, more cohesive, more balanced track. Second side of this record, and I keep not mentioning, by the way, Moat and Swing, which is the fourth track on side one, but let's just you know, leave that alone because I can't cover everything. So the second side of this album, I feel like, is where the Tone Poet really sings. And the reason why is because, again, those are the tracks that were recorded at Van Gelder's studio. Actually, I'm trying to think. Moat and Swing probably was too, so it kind of carries from side one into side two. And it's almost like starting with that Blue Note original recording. The folks at Tone Poet were just more comfortable with like how to deal with Rudy Van Gelder's recordings, and were able to they were able to give it the Tone Poet treatment. I think they did a really good job with it. Frank Foster and Kenny Burrell both sound better than they do on the original, but more importantly, the rhythm section is actually brought up more on an even playing field with the other musicians, and really, for me, I kind of almost want the two. I hesitate to say I want side two first in the order of the track list, because Get Happy, the opener, is such a strong way to open this album. But generally speaking, for me, side two feels like more of a sort of what I would expect out of a Blue Note album. It has the right sound, it has the right quality, you know, certainly the right sort of inspiration of the musicians, and more continuity, right? Because it's the same lineup across these tracks. So anyway, I mean, those are my that's kind of my assessment, I suppose, of the Tone Poet versus the original. And as you've heard, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. You know, there's some areas where I like the original. There's probably more areas where I like the Tone Poet. I think more importantly, because the original is just so difficult to get in decent condition. I couldn't find, I mean, I've been looking for years and years, and I have this like VG minus copy. Because you can't get a decent edition of this album, well, until now, right? I mean, now you can get a decent edition of this album, and I think Tone Poet did a great job of preserving, you know, what was on the original recording. They did make improvements for the most part. I mean, like 90% of this is like, you know, an improvement over the original, and they didn't do it in a kind of overwhelming way, right? So I've said on previous reviews that Tone Poet can have a tendency to bring out the cymbals perhaps a little bit too much. Or, you know, perhaps they changed the sound of the piano, and Rudy never, you know, had the piano sound like that, or, you know, whatever you want to say about how Tone Poet has been putting out albums. But, you know, this is one of those cases where they've really done a good job of preserving it, making subtle improvements. And personally, I think that this is a great way to hear this music. So, I, you know, for one, am a big fan of this. Probably not going to sell either, just because I have that weird like nagging thing, like don't sell the original, don't sell the original. So I'm going to just hold on to both and probably only play the Tone Poet, and that's just how it's going to go. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. Please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I've said it before, but this time I mean it. And yeah, I appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you next time.